Welcome to Monday through Friday, Cellular Agriculture for a Pandemic-Free Future. My name is George Ortega. This is episode number 48. I'm recording it on Thursday, September 10th, 2020 at 7:50 p.m. Eastern Time. And we have less than 2 months before Election Day. And I think this is the perfect opportunity to make a lot of progress in creating a pandemic-free world, or as close to it as possible. So the idea is we ask the politicians, we ask Trump, we ask Biden, we ask the Senate candidates, we ask the House of Representative candidates, just across the board, just regardless of the state senators, the state House members, a simple question, simply, what are you doing? Not even what are you planning to do? What are you doing to keep us, safe from another pandemic, so that we don't have to go through this again? It could be framed like, well, according to our infectious disease experts like Dr. Fauci, under this business as usual scenario, under the scenario we have now, it's not a matter of if we're going to have another pandemic that may be 40 times more deadly than this one. It's a matter of when. So in light of that, what are you doing to keep us safe? And I think along with that, to ask the question, let me share my screen for this. And again, for the audio podcast, I will be reading what's on here. So this is like a graph, a table that I created of the number of epidemics by millennium, century, decade, and year based on a wiki page that lists all of the epidemics, is easily accessible. And here's what you've got to basically point out to the politicians and the media to drive this national conversation. So we need to do this, and now's the time to do this. Don't wait until a year from now or however long it takes when we're no longer wearing masks, when we're getting back to normal. It could be that at that time people are so so tired of everything that they don't have the energy to or the interest to just delve into preventing the next one. People, it could be, I hope that doesn't happen, but people just don't want to hear about it. They just want to get to their normal lives again. So again, we've got 2 months to get our politicians to talk about this, to start this. And then once it's brought up in politics, then the experts, the epidemiologists can tell us, well, a universal vaccine is one of the ways we can be safe. And, but that's not going to happen, for another 10, 20, 30 years, perhaps, if we're lucky. So again, with this, you want to basically get our politicians to understand that this is not, as some of them have been saying, a 1 in 100 year event, that the frequency of epidemics, any one of which can turn into a pandemic, has increased in multiples, from the first millennium of this common era through this second decade of the second millennium, of the third millennium rather. So again, if you see on this chart, you see that in the entire 1,000, first 1,000 years of, you know, zero common era to 1,000, to year 1,000, I guess before the Middle Ages, there were only 8 epidemics, only 8. Okay, well, you know, what happened was during the second 900 years, I didn't go to the full 1,000 because I wanted to separate the last century from the second millennium. There were 126 epidemics, 12 times as many as in the previous millennium. Okay, and naturally you can see by this table that between, you know, between 14 and 1500, there were 2 epidemics. The century before that, there was one, and the 3 centuries before that, there were none. You know, starting in the 1500s, 1500 to 1600, there were 11. The next century, there were 24. The next century, 33. The next century, 55. And this is all explained by ships traveling the world, you know, sailing, you know, Columbus and you know, the various explorers, just colonization, just so much happened during those 400 or 500 years. But all right, so like, yeah, it's 12 times more likely, more epidemics, more actual epidemics than the millennium before that. But now here's where it just gets really, really, in a certain sense, scary for our future. You know, if we want to have a pandemic-free future, you know, we naturally, and again, for people to understand the difference, an epidemic, initially, what happens is you have a factory farm or an animal farm or a wet market, and either the virus develops from within, or there's a bat or wild animal that infects one of these domesticated animals and creates what's known as an outbreak. Okay, you know, so, and we have a lot more outbreaks than we have epidemics. For example, we had an outbreak several months ago in South Carolina, I believe, where we had to destroy 30,000 pigs to prevent an epidemic, you know. So then what happens is outbreaks turn into epidemics, which may be national, regional, may affect several countries, but they don't affect every continent, every country in the world. So like when an epidemic affects the entire world, like the coronavirus has this time, that's when an epidemic becomes a pandemic. All right, so again, back to this table, you know, again, the second millennium, 126 epidemics. This last century, now this last century, just, you know, 100 years, we've had 40. So about 1/3, a little under 1/3, the number of epidemics that we had in the entire 900 years before that. You know, and it gets worse because that's in the last century, right? Now let's go to the first decade of the 2000s, the first decade of this second century of this third millennium. And we have 42 epidemics, you know, not outbreaks, epidemics, which is more than we had the entire last century. Okay, and so now you see the problem, and now this is what you need to present to the politicians. You need to have them understand, to accept. And you know, I should probably post that that table. I should post it. I've got a blog that I do. Just get it out there. Or just, you know, I should probably send an email to various news organizations to get them moving on this, because now's the time to act. You know, so right. So like, so what? Let's say we got to that point. We get to the point where the politicians are asked this question, and initially they're going to be clueless, because politicians, you know, right now they're focused on getting reelected. They're not really all that much, ironically, focused on the issues. You know, especially an issue like this that hasn't been on the radar yet. Nobody's ever asked them before, well, what are you going to do to keep us safe from pandemics? So who knows how much research their staff, who knows how much research either party, the Republicans or Democrats, have done on this? Probably very little or none. Look at their websites, look at the websites of the candidates, look at the platforms, the political platforms of the two parties, major parties, you know, and challenge them, say, like, you know, why in your party platform, you know, that fine, you established it months ago, but you established it within the time frame of this pandemic, you know, basically. So if this is so destructive that it's going to cost us $8 trillion, which is almost half of our annual GDP, or you know, gross domestic product of our country, or annual salary, in a sense, or, you know, measure of production of the country, if it's so damaging to our economy, and it has been, it's killing so many lives, why isn't it on your party platform? And so yeah, you want to refer them to those facts on the table, that, you know, according to the evidence we have of epidemics, any one of those, and some of those epidemics have turned into pandemics, you know, what are you doing to keep us safe? All right, so now, I mean, you can guess this out. This isn't so difficult to figure out what they'll say initially. Initially, they'll say, well, you know, we need to, like, really much better fund the CDC, which is true. You know, we need to develop, you know, better testing and better tracking materials. You know, we need to develop a better system of communication and all. And yes, all this is true, but there's a problem with this answer. The problem with this answer is that it is in response to a pandemic that has already occurred. You know, in other words, once you know, an epidemic is becoming a pandemic, and so that this is an attempt to contain it. But there's a major problem with that strategy in preventing pandemics, and that is that some viruses are much more contagious than this coronavirus. That, you know, that they'll spread from person to person without, you know, people having symptoms, but they'll spread much more strongly. They'll spread to many more people. So the point to make, you know, when they say, well, you know, we're going to contain the next pandemic, is that, well, no, that's not good enough. That's not good enough, because the nature of these viruses, when they mutate, is to basically avoid those kinds of strategies, and you know, considering that there are so many more epidemics, you know, happening every decade than in the past, and this figure will be going up, you know, as each year and each decade progresses. It's just it's too risky to rely on containment strategies. They may, you know, politicians may say, well, we're going to up our vaccine programs so that you know, when we have another outbreak like this, we'll move fast. And actually, you know, the past has told you that a lot of times that they won't invest the funds, because what happens is, to the extent that they become successful in containing, let's say, several epidemics or several outbreaks through vaccines, which is really, you know, as we're finding, it's really very difficult anyhow. You know, again, the fastest a vaccine has ever been brought to market was in response in 1957. pandemic, and that took 4 years. And, you know, this one's taking 1 year because we're fast tracking it. But my point is that, you know, if you have a lot of outbreaks, you know, happening every decade, for example, I doubt the politicians are going to be spending that kind of money, you know, to develop a vaccine for each of those outbreaks and epidemics. You know, I think that's the reality. So, so what else? What other answers might they provide us? You know, well, they may say one of the drivers that I haven't talked about much in this show, but I've read is one of the drivers of these pandemics is that we encroach upon wildlife. You know, we're cutting down the Amazon rainforest and other wilderness areas, and when that happens, we come in contact with a lot of animals in the process. You know, the animals that ordinarily, you know, were deep in the forest and the woods are now much closer to us. And I think one of the major pandemics in the past resulted from they think a child, you know, a toddler, playing with an animal or something, a dead animal perhaps, that was infected. So anytime you have, you know, contact between people and nature and wild animals like that, you have that risk. So, all right, so what happens is, so like, you know, the politicians will give these kinds of answers. And this is where we're again in the conversation within these next 2 months. We, you know, this is an excellent opportunity to get this done. Within these next 2 months, we can have our infectious disease experts tell us, you know, inform the public that, well, the real problem is the farming of animals. You know, that's, I mean, certainly there are other solutions. In other words, we can cut down air travel. You know, we have 4 billion passenger flights each year going to every continent. I mean, like, you know, many of them. But I don't think that the politicians are going to do, well, yeah, we're going to cut down on air travel. I don't think they're going to do that. Or we can cut the population of the planet. You know, we can cut it from 7.5 billion to 5. And even that, you know, whether it's 5 or 7.5 billion, if you have that much air travel or close to that, you have a risk, a substantial, unacceptable risk. So eventually, you know, they're faced with this fact. It's not an opinion, it's not a perspective, it's a fact that in order to be reasonably safe, and fortunately for us, it's more than reasonably, you know, in order to be very safe, we can be very safe from future pandemics, we absolutely must end the farming of animals. You know, that's the answer. That's what we need to get our politicians to admit, understand, accept, and then inject into the conversation. Okay, so at that point, you know, let's say in October, we're having this national conversation. You know, people have taken advantage of this opportunity to take proactive measures so that we're not caught, you know, like we were this time, just, you know, trying to contain something that once, you know, again, once an epidemic, you know, people who are infected start traveling on airplanes, you know, and it becomes pandemic. It's so difficult to control because, you know, by that time, you know, people on most continents or almost all continents are, you know, have been affected. All right, so the last part of this is that, well, you know, the politicians may say, well, you know, we'd like to close these farms, these animal farms, But the reality is that we can't do that because that would mean, that everyone would turn vegan, and nobody wants to do that. People want to continue eating meat, fish, dairy, eggs. And that would be their first answer. But that, if you've been watching, this is the 48th episode, you've been watching this series, you understand that's what the series is all about. To introduce into politics, into the political debate as a very, very important issue, perhaps the most important short-term issue. Certainly the most important overall long-term is climate change, but I think this may be the most important immediate issue, preventing another pandemic. So at that point, the politicians are faced with needing to comment on, this prospect, cellular agriculture, clean meat, cultured meat, lab-grown meat. Are you aware that there's a technology where we can grow as much meat, fish, dairy, eggs as we want, and produce products that are incidentally much safer to consume? They can have no saturated fat. They are not GMO. They don't have cholesterol. They actually have healthy fats like omega-3 oils. Are you aware that we've already had proof of concept demonstrations that this technology works, and that there are 40 to 50 companies throughout the world now trying to meet the research challenges to scale up this industry so that it could create the factories, the food factories that will make us pandemic-free, risk-free. And that's where the real debate begins, because once our politicians acknowledge and understand that ending the farming of animals and creating, fast-tracking this new industry is our only hope, of preventing a pandemic, that we may have another pandemic during this next 10 years if we don't do this, under a business as usual scenario, or in the next 20 years, or even in the 30 years. Who wants to live with this? Again, the epidemiologists will have told them that no, universal vaccines for these, emerging viruses is not just possible and won't be possible for 20, 30 years. And, part of this, of course, would be to also scale up and fast track vaccine research. So perhaps, that would be a second arm to this. But so the last point, you want to get the politicians to consider and make statements about, make promises about, is that, well, how much are you going to spend on this? Fine. Transitioning from farming animals, and these factory farms especially, they're pandemic factories, pandemic breeding grounds, to this new technology that represents not just our best and a really wonderful prospect. Again, probably 99% pandemic free, risk free. The only that this transition isn't just our best way. It may be, it seems to be the only way we have now. Yes, let me make this very different. There is no other way to prevent these pandemics right now, until these universal vaccines get made, than ending these farms, stopping farming animals. So as cellular agriculture is the only way to do that, in a way that the global public will accept, then comes the money. Again, how much are you willing to spend? And let's say, some of these politicians are just kind of like not all that ignorant of how much we've spent, or how much would be reasonable. Let's say, well, we'll throw a few $1 billion into it. And at that point, then, that's when you remind them of the Congressional Budget Office assessment, the United States Congressional Budget Office. They did a prediction of how much this current coronavirus is expected to cost us once everything is said and done, once we're back to normal. And their assessment was that it's going to cost us about $8 trillion. And this assessment was made in May before the surge in cases in June and July, you know, that probably changed their estimate. You know, apparently we're expecting another surge this fall and winter. And so, but again, $8 trillion, then, you know, maybe the question to ask is like, if we're going to spend, this pandemic is going to cost us $8 trillion, how much do you think it's prudent, is wise for us to spend on this new technology that can keep us 99% pandemic risk free? And at that point, you know, we should be pushing for, well, we should be spending at least $50 billion. That represents 1/2 of 1% of what we've lost. You know, the $8 trillion we've spent on this. I mean, 1/2 of 1%, that's 7 times less than the average homeowner spends to insure their home, you know, as a percentage of the cost, the price of their home, of house or apartment, whatever, 7 times less. So really, we should be spending between 50 billion and 350 billion, ideally, on this. So, all right, so that's, you know, and the time to do it is now. So like, talk, if you have a journalist friend, if you have a, you know, researcher friend, a politician friend, somebody that you know, get them to understand this. I'm gonna, like, I guess I'll probably shoot a press release to a lot of news organizations and see if we can get this moving. Again, we've got 2 months, and once it's out in the public as a conversation, then yes, you know, God willing, Biden will win, and we'll spend the first several months of 2021 basically pushing for legislation to enact this, to get this moving, not in 5 years or 10 years, but immediately. All right, so we're at under a minute, so we're running out of time. Thanks for watching. Watch this series every Monday through Friday at 5 p.m. on White Plains Community Media, channel 76 if you get Optimum, 45 if you get Verizon. The series is also on YouTube in video form and on iTunes and Spotify in audio podcasts. I'm gonna, like, again, return to an optimistic tone next week. That's my plan on you know, how we can create a very wonderful world by doing this, by creating a pandemic-free future. Thanks for watching.